Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hi. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're so excited to be hosting the second event in our It's Up to Us Responsible Technology series in partnership with Omidyar. If we haven't met before, I'm Claire Graves and President of the Webby Awards. Welcome. Before we welcome our incredible guest this afternoon, I just wanted to take a little bit of a step back and give you all a bit of a background to the context to this series. In 2011, so a little while ago, at the 13th Annual Webby Awards, the inventor of the web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, was recognized with a Webby Lifetime Achievement Award. His hallmark five-word speech was free, open, keep one web. 5 years later, in 2018, we invited Sir Tim back to the Webbies to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the web. And his address to the audience was really focused on net neutrality and making sure that we keep the internet accessible to everyone all over the world. And this time he left the audience with just 3 words. It was up to us. So over the summer, as our team has been focusing on responsible technology and really thinking about our place within this ecosystem, we kept coming back to this call to action. We're really grateful to be in a position of influence on what gets made and what gets recognized in this space. So we think it's up to us to help inspire people to be thinking and taking action in responsible ways when it comes to the ways that they're building and working with technology. But moreover, we think up to us is a powerful mantra for our whole industry responding to this moment. We're so thankful to have the support of Omidyar Network on this partnership, who we're working with to introduce a series of categories to recognise this work and convene a group of incredible people to discuss the realities of responsible technologies and new ways to work. So I'm so thrilled to introduce our guest for this event, Mara Zepeda. She's co-founder and managing director of Zebras Unite, an international and intersectional hybrid cooperative creating the capital, culture, and community for the next economy. In 2022, Mara was named a luminary by Omidyar Network. Zebras Unite members include founders, investors, allies, and ecosystem buildings of a different stripe from around the world and has over 25 chapters on 6 continents. Prior, Mara was the founder of venture-backed software company Switchboard, now Hearken. Mara is a systemspreneur and a serial entrepreneur. She has also co-founded and was the founding board chair of Businesses for Better Portland, a progressive business organization, and XXcelerate. You know me, I'm always thinking about celebration, an entrepreneurship support organization for Oregon women entrepreneurs. So there's so much to talk about, but I just wanted to start broad. Mara, I would absolutely love you to tell us about Zebra. I personally love the concept of Zebras fix what unicorns break. So it would be great if you could tell us about Zebras Unite and your company mission.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Claire, and thank you to your extraordinary team. It's been so fun to prepare for this conversation with you and just have an opportunity to think deeply about some topics that I really love dropping into. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited as well.
Yeah. So oftentimes one of the first questions that we get is, what is a zebra? As you are correctly pointing out, we pronounce it in the rest of the world, or a zebra, as I often default to. And so basically the gist of it is that in 2017, we published a manifesto called Zebras Fix What Unicorns Break. And really what we identified was this other animal. Some of the folks that are tuning in today might be familiar with the Silicon Valley unicorn. This is a company that's valued at over $1 billion and is really all about exponential growth. And in that article and that Medium post, what we said was that the business model is the message. And we felt like there probably was a better way. So we identified this animal called the zebra. And there's a couple of qualities about the zebra that people find charming and also that relate to the movement. The first is that they're black and white. And so what we've noticed with zebra founders is they pursue both profit and purpose. The second is that they're real. So unlike unicorns that are a tiny fraction of the businesses that end up succeeding, we have zebras all over the place. There are so many businesses that identify as zebras. And finally, my favorite part is that zebras, in order to protect themselves from predators, they gather together in a herd, and that herd is called a dazzle. And so the idea being that we can be stronger together when we are pro-social, when we're all together. And so that very much depicted the behavior of the founders that we were seeing, who really wanted to build with. They weren't interested in monopolies and growth at all costs and kind of being the savior of the problem space. They were much more interested in seeing the problem fixed than being seen doing it. And that is sort of a big distinction, is, you know, where their ego is situated in the grand scheme of things. So we wrote this manifesto and we heard from tens of thousands of people all over the world. We were pretty blown away. And they said, you know, what you're describing is exactly what I'm looking for. And so I encourage folks to read the manifesto. We will drop the link in the chat if you haven't read it, back in 2017. And since then, we've spent the last 5 years building our own Zebra company, which is a hybrid co-op and nonprofit. We sort of have these two different arms that speak to one another. It's a multi-stakeholder cooperative that has hundreds of members and chapters all around the world.
I love the Dazzle. I think the Dazzle is amazing. When I read about the Dazzle, I was like, oh, it's so smart. And I hadn't even thought about us saying it differently. So I'll try and say zebra.
You were saying it. No, you're saying it correctly. The rest of the world says zebra. So I really like it.
Everybody says zebra.
It's American.
The chapters that you have is zebra. Well, you know, we're really focused on technology and responsible technology. So I'd love to hear from you what responsible technology looks like to you and what needs to be in place for tech to be made more responsibly.
Yeah, great question. So we answer that by talking about the what and the how it gets done. So in terms of the what, Zebras Unite has taken a pretty strong position that we feel pretty confident in at this point. It all comes down to ownership and governance. So what do we mean by that? We mean it matters who owns the companies and whether the people that create the value for that company are also enjoying ownership benefits as well. I think Twitter is probably going to be the company that we pick on in this conversation because it is so top of mind for so many people in technology. And so you can imagine what it would have looked like in an alternate reality if the users of Twitter ended up becoming the owners of Twitter. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible because of myriad reasons, but the primary one being that the shareholder price was set at a certain price that made that type of exit unattainable. So the first thing is ownership. And we really believe in alternative ownership models that are really in some ways centuries old when you get right down to it. Many of these are indigenous practices that we're simply borrowing from and referencing. So what does that look like? It looks like cooperatives, steward-owned ownership, multi-stakeholder ownership models. So that's the ownership piece. We really believe that in order to have more responsible technology, we need companies that have alternative ownership. And then there's the other question of governance. And governance is equally top of mind right now, right? And that comes down to who makes the decisions and who is in control. And what we believe, similarly, is the people that create the value should have some type of representation. That's why at Zebras Unite, we have a democratically elected board. And that gets to representation, democratic representation of different stakeholders. So that's kind of the what. And then in answer to your question, so how do we make that happen? How do we come to exist in this new bright future of more multi-stakeholder owned and governed companies? We really focus on 3 areas at Zebras Unite. The first is culture. So we've said from the jump, you can't be it if you can't see it. In other words, if we don't start to mainstream alternative ownership, multi-stakeholder ownership companies, the entrepreneurs of the next generation who are up and coming simply won't know that that's an option for them. So the first is around culture, and we pursue this through many different ways. Zebras Unite consults to companies, investors that are interested in incentivizing and modeling this. The second is community. So what we've seen is that so many people are really isolated and alone. They often identify as zebras and, you know, they may be surrounded by people that have different desires and intention. And so what we really do at Zebras Unite through our online community, our chapter program, our many educational offerings and the way that we experiment in public is to connect that community with one another, so that they can learn from one another, they can learn about their businesses and products and services. And finally, and in some ways, the really critical linchpin here, as many of you know who are tuning in, you need capital. You need capital to grow a business and to start a business. Access to capital is one of the major hurdles. And so what we are doing is working with incredible partners, essentially, to create new capital instruments that better align with the needs of entrepreneurs. And here I'll just refer to, we just published our manifesto for this year, just last week. And so we'll drop the link in the chat, and this will give you a very exhaustive overview of all of the work that we're doing on the ground in these spaces of capital, culture, and community.
Yeah, if everybody's paying attention, the links are being dropped into all of the chats and everywhere. There now, it's on the screen. It's very fancy, this software.
Very fancy. Thank you to Emma behind the scenes.
Yes, when we refer to Emma, that's Emma, our producer. We will be referring to her later. She's going to help us with some questions. All right, let me go on to our next question. So as part of our program with Omidyar in September, we launched a trend report on the state of responsible technology. And as part of our research, we spent the summer researching. We surveyed our community. We surveyed thousands of people about how they're thinking about responsible tech. Many of the survey responses cited a lack of funding, as we were just talking about, resource and time as big barriers to building responsibly. Co-ops like Zebras Unite are stepping in to mitigate that problem. So Mara, I'd love if you could dive a little bit further into that and talk about why you co-founded Zebras Unite and about the work you're doing to change the ecosystem.
Yeah, it's such a fun story to relive. If you want to go all the way back, my co-founder Jennifer Brandel and I, our backgrounds are actually in radio reporting. I was a financial reporter and economic reporter for NPR and other outlets just during the 2008 financial crisis. And so we have an inclination to ask a lot of questions and to be very curious. Curiosity is a major value of ours in the movement. And so we were both building companies, Jen in the journalism space, and I was building Switchboard in the higher education space. And the type of capital that we needed simply did not exist. It was flummoxing. And so we reconnected at SOCAP, which is a conference that is, ostensibly focused on helping entrepreneurs like us to access capital. And we were just pushing our faces up against the windows because nothing that we needed was there other than each other, which is always the way that these things happen. So I remember we were at a juice bar and we were sharing a juice or something because we couldn't afford the expensive juice. And we started to get
very expensive, though.
Very expensive. In San Francisco, the juice in 2013 was like $13. And we basically got to talking about how it felt like there was this cultural bias of a certain type of company. And we and our friends and many of the people that we knew, many of the people that were on the margins of entrepreneurship were not building businesses in this way. They didn't care about growth at all costs, exponential growth, shareholder returns, investor returns, making as much money as possible, and then, buying a place in the Bahamas. They were motivated by really different motivations. And a lot of them were building with the communities that they were solving the problems with and for. So there were principles of design justice. They were interested in collective ownership and shared prosperity and reinvesting in their community. And essentially we named it. So we found along the way, 2 additional co-founders joined us, Ania Williams and Astrid Schultz, who had their own experience as women founders that were trying to build in a different way. And so we all got together and wrote the manifesto. And that's kind of how the movement was born. And so that's a little bit about the founding story and why we founded it, basically born out of our own pain, as many things are founded. And in answer to your question about sort of changing the ecosystem, in the year that we published the manifesto, we held a gathering called DazzleCon, where hundreds of people from around the world got together and we began to co-design, okay, well, what's this future going to look like? And immediately what was clear was, it's that poem from Shel Silverstein, is the zebra black with white stripes or white with black stripes? it became so clear that we were stuck in this binary of, well, should we be a nonprofit or should we be a C Corp? And there wasn't really the right corporate structure that existed. And so what happened in the years since, we basically took 2 years, we did a deep survey of our community, which we'll share. And ultimately what happened is the correct corporate form of what we needed to be was invented just about the time that we were needing it, which is this more robust and creative multi-stakeholder co-op. And I won't get into the nuts and bolts of it. I'll just say that it was the perfect structure for us, which allowed us to be a hybrid organization, and it allowed us to serve all of the purposes that we hoped to. And so what it looks like in practice is our programs focus on community, culture, and capital. So we have this network of Zebra founders and then investors, and we also provide consulting and expertise to funders and investors and companies. And what we've noticed is that, as I mentioned before, we need to actually invent the capital products because a lot of times they don't exist. So that's been a really fun part of this journey.
So that's a big challenge. What are the biggest challenges purpose-driven companies and entrepreneurs face?
So to this point of capital, we'll drop in the chat a link to the Inclusive Capital Collective, which I'll share in a minute. But, we have a couple of different challenges. I would say it's not possible to talk about this without talking about the capital. We really need philanthropists and funders and banks and capital providers to step up. This is a huge unserved market where founders are looking for different flavors of capital. For some really powerful research that we often refer to, I direct people to the Kauffman Foundation's work on the capital ecosystem. And what you'll see is that 85% of entrepreneurs are not served by existing capital. You have on the one hand commercial loans, which are generally not a good fit for tech-enabled companies because we lack collateral or we haven't been in business for 5 years, or you don't have the 5 C's of credit that are traditionally what indicates creditworthiness. And then venture capital is really a particular instrument for a tiny sliver of companies. Maybe 0.1% of companies that are created are actually a good fit for venture capital that are going to reach that exponential growth, Facebook, Google style growth. And so what you have essentially is 85% of entrepreneurs that are not served by the existing capital system. So challenge number one, I would say, is getting access to that startup capital, that growth capital in order to create these types of companies. And then the other thing, just speaking personally, is the learning curve that's necessary for these alternative business models. Many people have heard of unicorns and Facebook and Y Combinator, but not many people have heard of Start.coop, which is the incubator for cooperatives. And so what we really see is entrepreneurs and founders that come to our doorstep really hungry for resources and looking for that type of education. And what we're trying to do is save them the tremendous opportunity cost. It's like the way that my co-founder Astrid describes it is it's like incurring brain damage because you're having to learn all of these new skills. So we really want to figure out how we can cut down on some of that opportunity cost so that these alternative models are more accessible.
Setting up a framework for people to work from, and then getting them. It's a jump start, really, isn't it?
Exactly.
So tell us what kind of companies. Tell us about the companies that kind of fit within this pillar.
So I think what was so amazing, and we'll drop the link in the chat, we did a Zebra survey about 2 years ago, and that surveyed our community because we really wanted to know, who's out there. I think the findings are very interesting. I'll just highlight a couple that are my favorite. The first is just the vast life experience of people who identify as Zebra founders. We asked a lot of really interesting questions, and these are people that are first-time entrepreneurs, and so many of them have never started companies before. Let's say some of them are, just the life experience of people raised in single-family households, people that may have been sex workers, people that experienced the problem firsthand, people that were first-generation college students. So what we noticed is that there was like a psychographic of people that was really coming together. Many of them are women and people of color. The other thing that we noticed, and this is one of my favorites, is that they are pro-social. So what we mean by that is that they recognize that problems have to be solved together, and they're interested in and naturally inclined towards solving with groups of people, and that's their preferred method. And we really see like that approach to problem solving to be collective and cooperative and community driven as what we need as we face the intense challenges that are facing us in this next stretch of time. So I encourage folks to look at the survey. And then as you'll see, a number of the companies are all across sectors. You have some that are products, services, tech enabled. We have, consumer packaged goods and manufactured products. There are people that are working on alternatives to many of the platforms that we know, but doing it from a cooperative lens. And many of those companies are addressing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals as well.
I have another link for the chat, Emma. I've been reading Julia Bornstein's When Women Lead book, and many of the companies fit under your pillar, I think, Mara. They're mission-driven companies and women that are working with their communities in lots of kind of really interesting ways. Very much recommend.
Totally. Yeah. And the OG blog post that maybe speaks to that a little bit is Sex and Startups, which was the first post that Jen and I wrote. And we'll throw that in as well. But yeah, it's like people build things in different ways. Yeah. And I love what you're picking up on, Claire, that like there are different ways that we can do anything. And the how of how we do something is just as important as the what of what we build.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, okay, so your main mission is to explore business models that are alternatives to profit at any cost. One of those alternatives is ownership structure, of course, which Zebras Unite uses as a founder-owned co-op. What other ownership models should business leaders or entrepreneurs explore to build responsibly?
Yeah, well, my first suggestion is just to become familiar with co-op principles. So there are 6 co-op principles, among them open and voluntary membership, democratic member control, economic participation of members, independence, education, information, and cooperation among co-ops, which is a really important one, and concern for community. And so the first thing I always want to emphasize is that you don't have to go out and incorporate as a co-op tomorrow. You can incorporate any number of different ways of working and making decisions probably in your existing structure. So that's the first is choose a lightweight way. How might you be able to change the way that your standing meeting is facilitated so that you have more group participation and you have different people facilitating it. That's like one small movement towards acting in a more cooperative way. Or how might you be more transparent with your decision-making matrix? At Zebras Unite as an example, we have all of the decisions that we have to make as a company broken down. And then how that decision is made, is it by consensus? Is it somebody just making the decision? Does it have to go to our board? And then who makes the decision, right? So you can start by almost doing an audit of your existing business and structure and figuring out, what are ways of doing this more cooperatively. In addition to Zebras Unite, which consults companies on these cultural practices, you have companies like The Ready and many other companies and books out there that are really trying to, reimagine how organizations behave. The second is to read Dr. Jessica Gordon Nemhard's book, Collective Courage, which chronicles the African-American business ownership and cooperative business ownership, which is really the tradition and its place in the movement for Black civil rights and economic equality. And you will see that we owe a huge debt to both the Black community as well as to century-old Indigenous practices of imagining a way that commerce and community can coexist. And finally, my favorite and kind of a deep cut, if you're really interested in going down the rabbit hole, some folks who've heard of co-ops may have heard of Mondragon, which is the world's largest co-op. It has about 80,000 employees. It's based in Spain. And many folks don't know that that co-op was actually started by Father Arizmendi Arriada. He was basically a Basque priest who was really influenced by social Catholicism. And so he mixed these teachings of social Catholicism and elements of the solidarity economy to build this company that is Mondragon. And his reflections, so his kind of personal reflections about how communities and individuals can transform, is phenomenally inspiring. And there was just a recent new translation of it by the publisher Solidarity Hall. So I highly encourage folks that are interested to check out Father Arizmendi-Arrieta's reflections, which just provide like a really poetic perspective to why any of us are doing this work.
So what kind of company are they?
Well, they're kind of a diversified company that have all sorts of like revenue streams and arms. They're sort of this like multi-headed hydra. And one of the cool things about it is you can go and study how they've built this business in Spain.
Oh, wow. That sounds so interesting. Okay, I'm reading it. That'll be my holiday reading.
Totally.
So in the opposite vein, you know, many of the companies that participate in the Webby Awards, part of our communities, the technology companies, a lot of our technology companies and startups use an exit to IPO or acquisition strategy, hoping to sell their companies to bigger companies or to investors by going public. Your work educates members on an alternative strategy, exit to community. For our audience, can you talk a little bit about what an exit to community option might actually look like?
Yeah, totally. So exit to community is a term that was coined by our C3 board member, Nathan Schneider. If you aren't familiar with his work, I highly encourage you to check it out. He's written a lot about ownership and governance. And so in the startup world, as you mentioned, Claire, exits generally occur when a company sells and is acquired, or if it goes public. So those are kind of the most traditional exits that companies will have. And what we began to contemplate is what Nathan began to contemplate is kind of what would it look like if you exited to the community that created value for that company. In other words, again, if something like Twitter were exited to its users or exited to the public, and what would it take to make that possible? And so we really started to think about this a few years ago when Meetup, the company Meetup, the path of that company was interesting. It was acquired by WeWork during WeWork's heyday. And then as WeWork was crashing and burning, they were offloading a lot of their companies. And we thought, you know, Meetup is such a perfect example. You have all of these organizers, and then you have all of these attendees of Meetup. So you have this really community-driven platform. What would it look like for Meetup to be owned by the community? So we wrote sort of a speculative fiction blog post called Meetup to the People, which we'll throw in the chat. And basically it imagined like what would it look like and what would the conditions be necessary to get this done. And so many people were really interested in that conversation that we ended up going on to host a cohort of founders who were interested in exiting their companies to their communities. And so we'll put that resource in the chat too. That website, the Exit to Community website, has all of the recordings of all of our incredible sessions with legal experts, with people working on culture and ownership structures and financing. And then we had a zine as well, which is an incredible zine and resource that kind of walks through, here's how you might begin to contemplate creating community ownership for your company.
I guess that Twitter just exited to one of their biggest users.
Yes, that's a really good way of thinking about it.
Just the one.
It exited to a community of one. And now we get to see the consequences of that decision.
Yeah, hopefully it works out in the end. We'll see. So what ecosystems need to be in place for this kind of model to successfully work?
Yeah, so again, to be a broken record about it, capital, community, and culture. What we really see is like on the capital side, we need patient and bold capital from funders and banks and investors to create the support and funding for alternative exits, you know, for these different ways that companies are built. You know, there are things like employee ownership conversions or ESOPs, which many people might be familiar with, and there's a niche amount of capital that's available for ESOPs. But if you were to say, we want to exit Twitter to its community, there's literally like no capital infrastructure in place to embark on that type of larger scale vision for tech platforms, especially. So we would say like the capital, community, and culture is really important. And then on the culture and community side, we really need more people that are educated about and then practicing cooperative and economic democracy in their daily lives. And I'd love to link here to two of our founding members from Aria Jockin and Jen Brandel, called Democracy Doesn't Need Saving, It Needs Creating. There are a number of practices that we can begin to embark on in our daily lives that are actually practicing economic democracy principles. And so we see that the more that people are practicing those types of practices and techniques with one another, the better we will get at democracy and at doing more collective decision-making processes.
So I want to talk now a little bit about the current models in digital industries and the model of profit over protection. Most companies use maximum profits as a measure of success. What metrics do you all use to measure success at a Zebra company?
Well, we aren't yet at a place, I think, where we can identify rote metrics, but I will say that right now, what's so exciting to us is essentially one metric is the variety of experiments that are being conducted. So what we say is we're looking for a Cambrian explosion of creativity of business models and financial instruments. So some metrics that we might look like are, what would it look like for 10% of new startups to be multi-stakeholder owned, where we're aspiring to have a larger portion of startups be owned by the community, by employees and things like that. Another metric might be, how many more capital products do we have on the market what's the volume of capital that is interested in investing in Zebra style companies? In our initial surveying, over $3 billion of assets under management held by investors right now are interested in investing in Zebra companies. So we see a huge demand from investors, and what we need to create now is kind of the plumbing to get that capital to the entrepreneurs. So how can we create more efficient plumbing so that all of these products aren't so niche and hidden, but the people that need them can really find them? How many companies adopt multi-stakeholder ownership and governance is one first metric. And then on the capital side of things, how much more capital is being directed to those styles of companies would be a first wonderful starting point. Beyond that, there are so many other frameworks that I would refer people to, like Kate Rayworth's work on donut economics around sustainability and ensuring that our companies and communities are working inside of the bounds of sustainability. There's the way that we might think about incentivizing companies to work together. How many collaborations can we incentivize of Zebra companies working together to solve these large problems? But yeah, profit, the growth at all costs, extractive capitalism is not the metric that's going to be top of mind for Zebras. That said, as we learned with Mondragon, co-ops can be billion-dollar companies, and so this isn't to say that it's an either or.
I love the idea of being able to also support the brands and the companies that you really believe in as well. I have just recently invested in my compost bin company, and I'm very, very excited about it. So I really am kind of fascinated and interested in how these other models are going to work, especially when you love something and you want to be ambassador for that company as well.
Totally. And was that through a crowdfunding campaign? Or?
Yeah, it was a crowdfunding campaign. It's an Australian crowdfunding campaign. So Subpod is the compost. If anybody's looking for an interesting compost bin, it really works. You have to make sure you're feeding the worms the right way, but it's great.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. And crowdfunding, is another example of, with all of the changes that we have to Reg A, and making those options more attainable with consumers like you that are falling in love with the product. That's another huge opportunity as well. And we're seeing a ton of Zebra companies on crowdfunding platforms like WeFunder that we have a partnership with. So it's a really exciting way for consumers to come along for the ride.
Yeah, and support. I love it.
Totally.
Well, okay, so there is, however, still a big misconception that businesses with mutually beneficial models aren't profitable or good for the long term. What would you say to leaders who believe that alternative models are not conducive to long-term success?
There's just a massive amount of research out there that shows otherwise, especially from a talent perspective and a retention perspective. You see that when it comes to economic downturns, co-ops are more resilient. They're both more profitable, and they end up sticking around and not disappearing in these boom and bust cycles. And the obvious reason why is because you have employee buy-in. The employees have ownership. And so as a result, they have a different level of investment in your company and in the company that they own. So what you've seen time and again when you look at research about co-ops is that over the long term, they end up being actually more profitable, and also they exist longer because they have these alternative models where the people creating value are seeing an upside. Right now, as people know, we're living through one of the most massive talent transitions, ever. And so you are hearing, especially from young people, that they want to work at companies that give them a say, that value their voice, that value their talents, that value their gifts, where they can have work-life balance, where policies can be created to support the health of their mental health, their bodies, their families, their communities, their overall well-being. And so really it feels like history is on our side here, that it's a matter of when, not if, that these types of models will become the mainstream, because this is just what you're seeing from the next generation. They're not going to compromise on things like environmental impact and sustainability and practices around equity and inclusion and sustainability and every other social problem that we are essentially confronting. They know that extractive capitalism is what has led to a lot of these downstream consequences. And so you just have a much savvier workforce that's seeing, I want to be a participant and I want to have more meaningful contributions to where I'm showing up every day.
So, our industry, our entrants, our community are really kind of focused on digital, of course, with the web. So we have a ton of advertising agencies that are participating in part of our communities, tech companies, a lot of brands. Are there any of these companies that have cracked the code?
Yeah, we'll actually put a slide up here that will sort of begin to look. This is just a little preview of some of these companies if people are interested. First, as I mentioned, from an incubator standpoint, I definitely recommend checking out one of our founding members, Start.coop, that is an incubator and accelerator for these types of cooperative businesses. When it comes to platform-enabled tech companies like Uber, you have alternatives like Drivers Co-op that's actually drivers owned. It's right in New York City in your backyard. And it's now the largest worker-owned co-op in the country. After just a few years, it has, I think, over 4,000 driver owners. So that's an alternative to Uber, where you have driver ownership. There's also companies like Driver's Seat, which is a data cooperative that lets the gig workers that are powering that economy to own and monetize their data. When it comes to then, so in addition to sort of the companies and looking at a couple of examples, if you look at the Start.coop alumni, you'll see a really broad spread of all different types of companies, ranging from agencies to, tech and digital. And then we get into the alternatives for financing, which is, kind of this, they always go hand in hand. And so here's where you start to have really creative models around, rather than looking at the 5 C's of credit, what does it look like to think about lending, actually kind of going back to the future. The way that commercial lending has always existed is you have a relationship with your banker down the street. So funds like the Matriarch Response Loan Fund in the Southwest are tweaking the ways that we assess the risk and creditworthiness of entrepreneurs from an Indigenous lens in a completely different way. And the Equitable Economy Fund is a fund that provides capital to accelerate cooperatively owned companies. So again, it's like, what I love about this journey is anyone that is coming at this from owning a company or being an entrepreneur or being a business owner or aspiring to be a business owner, you have to also become invested in the capital too. It's a both and. So what we love and what the Zebra community really represents is systempreneurs. They're people that are both working on their companies and they're aiming to grow a profitable, sustainable company. And they also recognize that there are pretty massive systemic barriers, especially around capital access. And we need their voice as well to create the solutions that will benefit their company downstream. And that makes sense to them. And then from a social media perspective, in terms of other examples, Hilo is an open source.
I'm very excited to try the Uber alternatives. We're going, as you can see, we have a holiday party tonight. So we should download and try.
I completely love, yes. It's so festive. Your outfit is just giving. It's wonderful.
So Well, you know, with this program, what we're really trying to do is work out pathways forward and give people kind of actionable ways that they can move forward as well. So I think we'll have a little bit of time for questions, but before we get there, questions from the audience. But before we get there, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about pathways forward. So lots of our audience are likely wondering how to design and build responsibly while navigating economic realities. Realistic, what would it take for more responsible ways to build to become the norm? So are there things that leaders within companies can do to start the evolution?
Yeah, well, I would say, I'm so grateful to the Omidyar Network's support and for programs like Luminaries, which we'll drop in the chat. I would say the first place on your journey would be to check out all of the work of the other luminaries that I am so blessed and honored and grateful to call my colleagues in this work. What I've noticed is that it's people that are driving this effort. It's grassroots movements. It's people that have been marginalized or that have worked inside of tech, and they've seen all of the harm that tech has done, and they are now working on changing those practices. And so the luminaries represent kind of an initial group of amazing people to get to know their companies, what the change that they're creating in the world, ways that you can support them. And so I would just recommend, start by building a list of, 15 or 20 people who are really doing this work at a deep level that you want to follow their stories. And then you'll start to see that it's a beautiful constellated network where everyone knows each other. We're all working together. Our organizations are working with one another. And I think what you'll find is that responsible technology and ethical technology is born out of people that are both responsible and ethical themselves. This is a mirror. The business models are a mirror of who we are and how each of us shows up in the world. And you can see the quite damaging consequences when we prioritize narcissism and the ego and dominance. And then you can see the way that other people are showing up in the world from a place of collaboration and cooperation and mutualism. And we want to incentivize those people and those practices. So the Luminaries group is a great first place to start.
Amazing. And that link is in the chat. Forgive me. All right, I think we can go to questions. Emma, should we pull out the questions?
I will take a sip too.
Okay, here is one for you. Sorry, my cough is here. I'd love to hear Mara speak to what zebras can do when they see unicorns in the industry breaking things.
Yeah,
it's one thing to run your company responsible, but competitors, peers acting irresponsibly makes it so much harder.
Yeah, great question. I know it can be really easy to feel defeated and deflated and distracted by just how much is being broken right now. It's truly profound. I would say from my own experience, I found so much solace in finding other like-minded companies like mine. So finding other entrepreneurs. So first of all, please join the Zebras Unite online community where you'll learn, you'll find there are 10,000 members from around the world. Introduce yourselves and your products. We'll put the link in the chat or after. But the community is the solution, and together we will win. And so I would say first is sit down and just ask yourself, who am I surrounded by right now? Who is in my support network? Who are the people that I'm talking to that have challenges similar to this? So often we can feel really isolated, and it's the isolation and alienation that's leading to those deep feelings of frustration. So I would say step number one, get yourself a community of people. And then I think what you'll soon discover is actually the solution is in that community itself. Just as background for folks that are curious, Zebras Unite was actually built with 25 founding members that each put in sweat equity to build the co-op. We didn't have $500,000 to capitalize the co-op when we were just getting started. So what you'll start to find is you can trade time and talent with other companies to potentially start to solve some of the challenges that you face. And so the assets and the beauty and the possibility inherent in community can often be like the first step towards not feeling angry and alone and defeated by all of the breaking around you. But my heart goes out to you, and I really appreciate the question. I relate to it a lot.
I agree. The community is the key, and I think that we've seen that over the last couple of years. That community is really one of the most important things that we have as humans in the world. So finding your people is so important. This is a great question. I was just looking at this question from Steve Downs. Have you seen good models of how organizations actually prioritize and optimize values such as equity, inclusion, sustainability, and health and well-being in operational ways?
Yeah, a number of resources here, and I'll throw one here. So first of all, I would recommend that you check out the Inclusive Capital Collective. This is a group of emerging fund managers. Many of them are coming from communities of color, essentially, that are supporting businesses that are owned by businesses of color, are owned by entrepreneurs of color. And the Inclusive Capital Collective, there's a series of research papers on different financial instruments. And inside of those research papers, you'll actually find a lot of examples of what it really means to prioritize equity and inclusion. And you'll come to see that it has to do with the way that we build with and not for the communities that we serve. So shout out to the Inclusive Capital Collective. In terms of just practical resources, folks that have been really instrumental to me, which I will pull off my bookshelf here, is Ari Weinsweg and from Zingerman's Deli. If you are not familiar with the Zingerman's work, they have a whole training program called Zing Train. And Zing Train essentially trains leaders on these types of practices, on doing more transparent practices. So the Zingerman's books and their training programs, I can't recommend enough. If you go on zebrasunite.coop/partnerships, we have, at this point, I think nearing 100 partnerships with other training and education firms, such as Greater Than, that are providing training and courses to how to operationalize this inside of your organization. And then, of course, there's books that folks might be familiar with, like Reinventing Organizations, that provide kind of blueprints and frameworks for how to bake these practices in. So what I would say is, like, Steve, you're at a very exciting point of a learning journey, and please don't reinvent the wheel. There are so many people out there that are already doing really amazing work to help to bake in and operationalize many of these practices. So some initial places to start are, what the ICC is doing, as well as Zingerman's and Zing Train and Reinventing Organizations as first places to start. And then there are so many other networks that are pursuing this as well. I would recommend also checking out SELC, which we'll put in the chat as well.
Great. All right, Michael Grossman. Oh, I think there was a question before that. No, from Michael? Here. Are there templates for exit to 3-part hybrid community, selling an existing C Corp to its customers, workers, and existing investors?
Yeah, in terms of templates, I guess I would recommend you take a look at the Exit to Community zine. That provides just a number of different case studies for how people did things in a different way. So you'll get a lot of resources there. I'll throw that link in the chat also. So I would recommend starting with the zine, which does provide some templates and frameworks to think about. In terms of a lot of this comes down to like legal nuts and bolts and just the logistical legal. And so we work with Jason Weiner's law firm, and we'll throw that link in as well. And so oftentimes just speaking with a lawyer that has experience on how to re-architect some of this can be a helpful first step. SELC, the Sustainable Economies Law Center that I just mentioned, that we'll throw a link in the chat, also has a lot of really phenomenal resources as well. So yeah, in terms of your specific question, Michael, I would say hybrids are a wonderful journey, and I encourage you to follow them. And again, finding as many examples as possible, asking if you can read people's bylaws, finding past educational programs that they may have done, going into the nitty-gritty of what their bylaws are, it can be really useful. And one other resource that I'll just park in the chat is a blog post called Pivot to People, where we kind of got into the nitty-gritty of how we arrived at our hybrid, if that's of interest at all. I should also mention that if you are interested in nerding out on all of this, please become a member of Zebras Unite. You can become a member owner of our co-op. And this gives you sort of like a behind the scenes look at how we do all of this because you will be doing it with us. And so we ourselves are a cooperative, and a really direct way to start to plug into these resources is to become a member yourself.
And you just become a member on your website.
Exactly. Yeah. If you click on join, you'll see sort of we have an orientation session and an onboarding, and we're going to be relaunching the membership program early in the year based on a lot of phenomenal feedback that we've gotten from this first couple of years of being a co-op.
Okay, amazing. Well, I think this has been incredible. I have personally learned so much. I hope it's been really valuable to our audience. I imagine that they have got a lot of takeaways, and we all have a lot of reading to do.
I know.
I want to say thank you, Mara. It's so insightful for me and really enjoyable to chat as well.
It's a total pleasure, Claire. Thank you and your team so much. I'm grateful to connect with all of you. Follow me on Twitter. You can find Zebras Unite on Twitter as well, and we'll link to the co-op. Please join us on this journey. It's a total blast, and we have so many amazing things planned for 2023. We have a team of incredible people now all around the world, and what they have dreamed up and what our strategic plan for 23 looks like. I just got some sneak peeks. It is truly beautiful. So please join us for this journey in the new year. We would love to connect with each and every one of you.
I also encourage everyone to dive into the Medium as well, as we've got so much going on your Medium. And are you what's your Twitter handle?
Mine is my full name, Mara Zepeda, and Zebras Unite is Zebras_Unite. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much, Mara.
Thank you, Claire. It was a pleasure. And thank you all.